Warmus was smart, sexy, and determined to get what she wanted at all costs. What she wanted was Paul Solomon. All she had to do was get rid of Mrs. Solomon. Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of The Dark Side of Love, focused on women who kill. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love, and this week I'm diving into the case of the teacher, her lover, and his wife. Carolyn Warmus was someone who had pedigree written all over her. Born in Troy, Michigan in 1964, Carolyn grew up in the ritzy Detroit suburb of Birmingham. Her father, Thomas, was the founder of the American Way Life Insurance Company, which resulted in him becoming a self-made millionaire. I'm talking private jets, estates, and yachts wealthy. Carolyn's parents split when she was 6, with her mother eventually winning custody of Carolyn and her younger brother and sister. The divorce didn't stop blonde, blue-eyed Carolyn from becoming an all-American girl. She was known as a hard worker. She was a member of the basketball team at Seaholm High and an all-around nice person. As one neighbor described her to the New York Times in 1990, she was, quote, the kind of girl you want to bring home to mom. Carolyn went on to obtain a psychology degree from the elite University of Michigan and later earned a master's degree in elementary education from Teachers College Columbia University, another esteemed institution which counted such alums as Art Garfunkel, Shirley Chisholm, and Georgia O'Keeffe. Carolyn's winning streak continued when she scored a position at Greenville Elementary School in Scarsdale, New York, which is located in Westchester County, one of the wealthiest, most exclusive counties in the country. And within Westchester, Scarsdale is the richest of them all, with Bloomberg reporting its average household income to be over $417,000. That's dollars, y'all. Not long after her arrival at Greenberg, 23-year-old Carolyn crossed paths with fellow teacher 38-year-old Paul Solomon. Of Lebanese descent, Paul has a full head of dark, thick hair and dark brown eyes. He's got a medium build and average height, and in general is considered attractive. In fact, enough women found Paul attractive enough that he had multiple affairs during the 19 years he was married to his wife, Betty Jean. Soon after Carolyn and Paul met, they started an affair. For Paul, Carolyn was the latest in a long line of distractions. Another fling, another notch on the bedpost, all those cliches. She was quite a bit younger than he was, 17 years to be exact, and he was drawn to her vivacious, carefree personality. Sure, she was a little crazy, but Paul likes a little cray-cray in his coffee. As he put it, it's very hard to resist Carolyn. While Paul was treating this entanglement with Carolyn as a fun little fling, as was his way, for her it was much more serious. In fact, every relationship Carolyn had ever been in was always lopsided. So let's roll back the clock for a minute. Take a little stroll down memory lane. If you've ever watched a Lifetime movie, which of course you have, then you're used to stories about women stalking men and the women who love them. This is the bread and butter of Lifetime. Back in the late 80s, before Lifetime was feeding us a steady diet of my psycho ex and my crazy whatever, in 1987, a feature film starring Michael Douglas and Glenn Close exploded across movie screens. On its face, Fatal Attraction was a simple little story about a man who cheats on his wife. Nothing special about that, dime a dozen. Now, make the mistress a murderous, bunny-boiling cuckoo clock, and it's a whole different ballgame. Fatal Attraction freaked folks out, the men anyway. For about a hot minute, married men were terrified to cheat on their wives because the women they cheated with might go full-on knife-wielding kidnapper on them. Just wasn't worth it, right? In the movie, the Glenn Close character Alex develops a wholly unhealthy obsession with Michael Douglas's character. All he wanted was to bang her a few times and then go back to his marriage. But as Alex famously said, she was not going to be ignored. This is very much how Carolyn Warmus operated. Carolyn was not the girl you said, let's just be friends to when you broke up with her. Carolyn was not having it when a man said, it's not you, it's me. When Carolyn got her hooks into a man, it was her intention that those claws would stay there forever. First case in point. While she was a sophomore in college, she dated a teaching assistant for a little while. He broke it off and later became engaged to another student that he had started dating after he broke up with Carolyn. Well, Carolyn wasn't trying to hear that. She left messages on their answering machine, called the guy nonstop, harassed his friends, and the couple did what anyone would do: change their digits to an unlisted phone number. Now, do you think that stopped Carolyn? No, of course not. She finagled the number out of a phone company employee through subterfuge, as noted by the New York Times. But she didn't stop there. Carolyn broke into their house and unleashed a fire hose of letters onto the couple, including one where she claimed to be pregnant with the guy's baby. Newsflash, she wasn't. She bothered him at work and just unleashed a ceaseless and ferocious quest to win the guy back. I mean, maybe she thought he would be flattered. I don't know. As the New York Times reported, a few weeks before the wedding, Carolyn left a note for the fiancé that read in part, "I really hope you enjoyed this past week of not being bothered by me, because now that I'm back from vacation, you can start worrying all over again." Like, this was her full-time job, right? That harassing these two. Well, of course, this spooked them into getting a restraining order against Carolyn in case she tried to crash the wedding and or the reception. Following the wedding, the newlyweds got a permanent restraining order against Carolyn. Eventually, Carolyn moved on to a married bartender in New Jersey. Much like the teaching assistant before him, the bartender went out with Carolyn for just a little while before breaking things off and going back to his wife. Carolyn took a little bit of a different tack this time around in dealing with his rejection. So instead of launching the Carolyn Warmus Take Me Back or Else campaign, she decided to hire a private investigator to follow the guy around. Vincent Parco, a PI from Manhattan, got the job. The Chicago Tribune described Vincent Parco as a cross between Danny DeVito and Bob Hoskins. You remember him? He was in the Jessica Rabbit, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Jessica Rabbit movie. Vincent had also once taught a course at the local learning annex called How to Get Anything on Anyone. The Tribune also reported that he termed his relationship with Carolyn as, quote, social bordering on dating, and that he was infatuated with her. According to true crime author and historian Albert Borowitz, Carolyn and the PI came up with an idea to doctor up some sexy time photos of her and the bartender and send them to the wife. Apparently, they never went through with this little scheme because, as it turns out, she no longer needed the pictures because she had already met Paul Solomon. However, Carolyn and Vincent stayed friends because, hey, you never know when you might need a private investigator on speed dial to follow around ex-boyfriends and mock up fake photos. Now, remember the name Vincent Parco, because this is not the last time you'll hear about him. Okay, so back to Carolyn and Paul. In an attempt to ingratiate herself with him, Carolyn struck up an acquaintanceship of sorts with Betty Jean, managing to finagle dinner invitations to the Solomon home, and she even forged a friendship with Paul's teenage daughter, Kristen. She took the 13-year-old on skiing trips, showered her with gifts, and pulled the girl into her confidence. Carolyn was concerned, apparently, that Betty Jean didn't like her. That's funny, right? Worried that the wife doesn't like you? Like, did she think they were going to be curling each other's hair and painting each other's toenails? At some point during the 18-month affair with Paul, he decided to cool things off for just a minute. And Albert Borowitz noted that Carolyn confided her frustration to a friend that the relationship with Paul was not, quote, progressing in a manner with which she was comfortable. So, reading between the lines, pretty good guess. She was waiting for him to leave his wife, and he wasn't cooperating. Bottom line, Carolyn wanted Betty Jean out of the way so she could have Paul all to herself. And for once, Carolyn was going to get her man. So if Paul wasn't going to move the needle, Carolyn would have to do it for him. January 15th, 1989. Paul and Betty Jean are hanging out at home watching TV. Kristen is on a ski trip with friends. And at 1:37 that afternoon, Carolyn called Paul and the two made a date to meet that night at 7:30 at a place called Treetops, which was a restaurant located inside the local Holiday Inn. Like any good cheater, Paul tells Betty Jean he's going bowling. Betty Jean, who is camped out on the couch watching television, tells him to have a good time. Huh. The battery on Paul's car is recharging, so he takes his wife's car to meet Carolyn. Well, actually, he did stop off at the local bowling alley for a hot minute, I guess, so he could tell Betty Jean that yes, he had gone bowling that night. He makes the rounds, says hi to a couple of people, watches a few minutes of whatever game is playing on TV, and then he takes off. He gets to Treetops and parks himself at the bar with a drink while he waits for Carolyn. She strolls in at 7:45. They have oysters, fries, hamburgers, champagne, more champagne, deep conversation. And then 2 hours later, the lovers head out to Carolyn's car, sequestered in a dark corner of the parking lot. Per their usual, they had a little getting it on time in the car. Moments later, the deed done, Paul exits Carolyn's red Hyundai and gets back into his wife's 1988 Dodge and heads for home. 11:40 p.m. Paul enters his apartment. The TV is on, loud. The lights are out. Paul sees Betty Jean on the floor. He claims he thought she was asleep. He reaches down to touch her. She's cold. He turns her over. There's blood everywhere. Paul figures she hit her head after falling down. 11:42. A hysterical Paul calls 911, and after some confusion about which town's police unit should be dispatched to the address, officers arrive at the Scarsdale Ridge apartments and survey the scene. Betty Jean was pistol whipped about her head multiple times. Her body was riddled with 9 bullets to her back and her legs. She was 40 years old. There weren't any signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no neighbors that had heard the gunshots. The only thing out of place that officers found was the telephone receiver just out of Betty Jean's reach, the jack unplugged from the wall, a black wool glove near Betty Jean's body, and 6 .25 caliber shell casings. As always, with cases like this, Paul, being the husband, is suspect number 1. Of course, he's got a rock-solid alibi, bowling alley and banging Carolyn in her red Hyundai. And officers note he really does seem upset by his wife's death. He seems scared, appropriately nervous, fairly forthcoming. Paul does fess up about being with Carolyn that night, even though his times were a little off. As it turns out, at the time that Paul was leaving the bowling alley, 7:15, Betty Jean made a 911 call and could be heard screaming, "He or she," the dispatcher wasn't sure which, "is trying to kill me." The call was routed to the police, but again, just like when Paul called 911, there was some confusion over phone numbers and locations. The operator transposed some of the digits in the phone number, so the call went to the wrong police department, which in turn sent it to another police department, and then because the phone numbers were mixed up, police got the wrong address. When everything seemed fine at that address, they determined it was a phony call. The police questioned Paul, they questioned Carolyn, but they got nothing. And the longer a case goes without an arrest, the harder it is to solve. And this case goes ice cold. They don't give up, though. The first thread they tug on are Carolyn's phone records. And Vincent Parco's number comes up quite a bit. There's also a call to a gun shop in New Jersey about a week before Betty Jean's murder. Then there's Carolyn's behavior. Instead of falling into Carolyn's arms following the murder of his wife, Paul dropped Carolyn. He subsequently became involved with a woman by the name of Barbara Baller. Well, this, of course, it just won't do. Carolyn reverted to what she did best, which was to go balls to the wall. About 5 months after Betty Jean's murder, Paul and new girlfriend Barbara go on a romantic getaway to Puerto Rico. Wasting no time, right? Carolyn gets on a plane and follows them. Of course she does. While she's in Puerto Rico, per her usual, she is obsessively calling Paul, who's not answering. When that doesn't work, Carolyn makes another phone call, this time to Barbara's family, pretending to be a cop, and tells the family member that answers about Paul being a suspect in his wife's murder and how they need to put a stop to this relationship for Barbara's own good, of course. Barbara, just like the woman Carolyn had harassed a few years earlier, takes out a restraining order. Police, meanwhile, are busy behind the scenes looking for that concrete link that will tie Carolyn to Betty Jean's murder. They finally get it when they examine the sales records at that gun shop in New Jersey. On January 15th, records show a woman by the name of Lisa Katai had purchased ammunition for a .25 caliber pistol. However, when police question Katai, who is also a blonde, she says, "Nope, you got the wrong one." Turns out, her license had been lost or stolen the previous summer when she was working a temp job in Manhattan. And guess who her coworker was? Carolyn's good friend Vincent Parco would prove to be her ultimate undoing. Turns out he gave her, shocker, a .25 caliber pistol with a silencer. Also, remember that Carolyn was late meeting Paul on the night of the murder, so she doesn't really have a real alibi. I have to say, you've got to have some pretty big balls to kill your boyfriend's wife and then go meet him for cheeseburgers. Police arrested Carolyn on February 2nd, 1990, over a year after Betty Jean's murder. Inevitably, the comparisons to that little bunny boiler of a movie were swift, with the media dubbing it the Fatal Attraction murder case. And this case just exploded in the media. It had infidelity, money, murder, a sexy, hard-to-resist blonde, tailor-made for the tabloids. The Toronto Sun breathlessly reported that Carolyn Warmus, at times so demure, so alluring, was every bit as obsessive and lethal as her fictional counterpart. That's just a tidbit, but I think you get the gist. And Carolyn sure did enjoy giving people a show. Every day of her murder trial, Carolyn played her role to the hilt, turning up in designer clothes, tight little miniskirts, and high heels that showed off her legs, her blonde hair a sleek bob. There was no slinking into the courtroom each day for Miss Carolyn. Oh no. It was prancing and preening, more like she was at a movie premiere than a murder trial. And the media could not get enough. Licked it up. As TrueTV.com observed, she was a femme fatale, right out of 1940s film noir, a woman who broke all the rules. She was a symbol of love gone wrong, an affair that spiraled out of control until it ended in murder and betrayal. She was the rich, spoiled heiress on trial for her life who wanted a man so much she was willing to kill to have him all for herself. As you might imagine, Carolyn's trial was a total shiz show, with folks like Vincent Parco and Lisa Katai testifying against her. Her defense team tried to pin Betty Jean's murder on Vincent Parco. They tried to pin it on Paul Solomon. They tried to pin it on the one-armed man. I'm kidding, they didn't try to do that. Ultimately, after 11 days of deliberation, the jury deadlocked and a mistrial was declared. Carolyn's second trial began in January of 1992, 2 years now after Betty Jean's murder. Things were quite different this time around. Though the media was just as rabid as ever, it seemed Carolyn had tired of playing her part. No more fashion shows, no more parading into the courtroom in the latest designer outfits. TrueTV.com noted that Carolyn brought a pillow with her each day so she could rest during the more, quote, tedious parts of the proceedings. And reporters observed that she seemed distant, not all there. In the interim between the two trials, 2 TV movies were waiting in the wings. Paul had sold his rights for one of the movies, which kind of pissed people off since the murder trial was still happening. And oddly, he still lived in the apartment he had shared with Betty Jean, something else people found kind of strange. This is where his wife was murdered and he still hadn't moved out. I'm sure he had his reasons, but people just found it really kind of strange. And if you've got nothing to do on a Saturday afternoon, those movies are A Murder's Affair, the Carolyn Warmus story starring Virginia Madsen, and The Danger of Love, the Carolyn Warmus story. And that's with Joe Penny. Remember Joe Penny, Jake and the Fat Man? Whatever happened to Joe Penny? I need to track him down. Ultimately, Carolyn was found guilty the second time around, with the judge sentencing her to 25 years to life. Carolyn proclaimed her innocence, but the judge didn't want to hear it, calling the murder a hideous act. Carolyn served 27 years in the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, having been released on June 17, 2019 at the age of 55. According to the New York Daily News, Carolyn underwent surgery for a brain tumor in 2018. As a condition of her release, she will be on parole for life. Thank you so much for joining me for this bonus episode of The Dark Side of Love, Women Who Kill. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes, transcripts, and a chance to support the show. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another story of women who kill. I'll see you on the dark side.